Hello, everybody. This is Rabbi Marcus Rubenstein from Temple of Aaron. It's so nice to have you with us today. Nice to see you, Liz and Amy. Appreciate you being here. Whether you're joining us in person or on Zoom or on Facebook, on podcast or on YouTube. Oh, amazing. Thank you for joining us to learn Torah today as we continue our learning Talmud and to understand how really from the sugya and the discussion that we're learning, our focus really is going to be on trying to understand where rabbinic authority has jurisdiction over and where it doesn't. And that will really give us an understanding of sort of what the function of rabbinic power is and what the rabbis were trying to do. And I think in a bigger question, what is the authority that anybody has in this world? What is the what is the laws that we can make or adjudications we can make on the Torah, right? If we have this written law system of the Torah that God revealed to us, what is the role of human beings? What are we supposed to be doing with that? Are we just supposed to, whatever the laws are sort of what we are supposed to have? Or is there more of a role for human beings to play in order to shape that and to alter that? So in order to do that, we're going to jump into our sugya today. We learned the Mishnah previously and in our last session last week, and we'll review the Mishnah and then continue into the Talmud and some commentaries on that this week. So as I do that, we're back. Remember, this is the Mishnah we learned last week, and if you weren't here for the Shiur last week, this will be a great review, and you'll be able to jump in and kind of get level with where we are. So the discussions in the Talmud usually start with first a Mishnah, and then the Talmud is sort of acts as a commentary discussing the questions that start left in the Mishnah. So we'll quickly review the Mishnah and then move on to some new material. So the Talmud teaches, the tailor may not go out with his needle adjacent to nightfall on Shabbat Eve, lest he forget and go out. So this teaching is that there is this tailor, right, who has, the situation is that it's right before Shabbat, and on Shabbat, one of the malachot of Shabbat is the prohibited labors of Shabbat, one of the 39, as delineated in the 7th chapter of Mishnah Shabbat, is carrying from one domain to another, right? That is prohibited to carry any object, even if it's a tiny little object, in this case, from one domain to the other. So in this case, we have the case of a needle, right? So technically, if we carried a needle in a place without an eruv, from our house to outside the house, our own house into the public area, technically on Shabbat, we'd be breaking a Torah violation if we did that purposely. But this case is a little different to that. It's not actually on Shabbat itself, right? It's adjacent to nightfall on Shabbat. We know that nightfall is when the Shabbat actually begins, right? At sunset, at Shkiat HaChama in Hebrew, sunset in English, right, is when Shabbat begins, because the Jewish day begins evening, right? So this is actually before Shabbat. So is it actually prohibited in the Torah to carry out any object before Shabbat actually begins? And the answer is, of course, no, it's not prohibited. It's, of course, permitted to carry objects during the week. But it seems for some reason that the rabbis are prohibiting the doing of this to adjacent or near nightfall. And of course, we're going to have to understand, what does it mean adjacent to nightfall eventually? But near nightfall, we have to make some sort of extra prohibition on ourselves. And the reason that the Mishnah gives is Shema Yishkach ve'etzeh, right? Lest he forget and go out, right? Very, very important. And so there's a fear and there's a concern for the sages that the person is going to forget that he has the needle, and he's going to go he's going to go out on Shabbat and then violate a Shabbat law on mistake, right? Seems like that is the question, or that is what the Mishnah at least is saying, right? We've all forgotten something in our pocket and went out on mistake or something like that. The Mishnah continues and says the similar thing with a scribe, right, who has a quill or a pen, right? Same thing, very similar. Continues, and one may not shake his clothes, and one may not read a book by candlelight. Now, we discussed in our last class that this particular section of the Mishnah, it's questionable of whether this is still adjacent to nightfall, meaning near nightfall, or that it's not actually Shabbat yet, or has the Mishnah now switched topics and is now specifically talking about a case in which these things are happening on Shabbat, right? And so we have shaking the clothes. This was really meant to get rid of bugs, right? And you would do this near a candle so that you could see the bugs, right, and get them out of your clothing, or to read a book near candlelight, which obviously, again, we're using a candle. The concern seems to be here is that maybe in order to see better, we'll tip the candle or move the candle in some way on Shabbat, which will then be considered a malacha because you're moving some wax into the flame, which is causing more ignition, which is a prohibition and violates is a performance of the malacha of Aish, right? Of making a fire. Right? We're not allowed to ignite a flame. So that is the concern here. But again, I want to point out that this still is not a Torah prohibition, right? Because of course it's permitted to shake one's clothes on Shabbat, and it's certainly permitted to read a book on Shabbat, and even read a book. You would think by candlelight, or yes, I would even say 100% by candlelight, at least according to Torah law, because as long as you don't ignite the flame. But it seems again, this is an example where the rabbis are sort of extending the laws and guidelines of the Torah in order to protect the doer from violating the law. Right? The Mishnah continues. However, in truth, they said an established halacha, right? So they kind of clarify themselves according to a particular law. The attendant sees where in the book the children under his supervision are reading in the Torah, even by candlelight on Shabbat. So there is a sort of disclaimer here, or a case that is excluded from the previous general rule, that an attendant can look with candlelight where the children have stopped or have read the Torah this week, or have been learning the Torah portion this week, in order to see where the Torah needs to be read from, because the teacher is around the student, and the teacher is going to be extra careful around the student to make sure not to violate Shabbat and not tip a candle. And so the sages are less concerned that the attendant will mistakenly break Torah law by putting the wax into the candle. So that's what we seem to see here. So there are some cases, at least according to the Mishnah, where if this concern is mitigated somewhat, that we're going to, on mistake, violate the Torah, then it seems like this fence can drop off. The Mishnah continues. However, he himself may not read. And I think we can obviously understand why the Mishnah is saying this, right? Because he can't read when he's alone, right? Because if he's alone, then he doesn't have his students there. And he might not be as careful with his own decorum and his own behavior and be as sensitive than if he was trying to be a good dugma or trying to be a good guide for students. Similarly, the Zav may not eat with his wife, the Zava, because there's the word is here, because then he might become accustomed to transgression or sin, right? The Zav, I didn't translate this here because it would be a hard word to translate. The Zav particularly means someone who is having a bodily secretion from their body of a sexual nature, I would say a non-normative one, not something that is a little different, right? They enter into a place of spiritual impurity and need to immerse themselves in the mikvah in order to enter the sacred confines of the temple, right? Of course, the temple doesn't exist anymore, so we don't worry about this as much. But In this particular case, right, especially at the time when the temple was established, it is actually a sin, a transgression for a person to make contact or to be in contact with their partner when they are spiritually impure, because this would render him spiritually impure, right? And then they would not be able to enter the Torah confines. Now, the rabbis seem to be extending this law somewhat by saying that the partner cannot even eat with the wife because then they might touch each other, right? And from eating together, you might come to touch each other, and you might come to violate the Torah. So that's already a fence that exists. This seems to be even another fence, which says that two people who both the man and the woman, the two partners are both in a state of spiritual impurity, right? There is a zav and a zava, a male and a female zav. Even in that case, they can't eat together because, and there is no concern that they're going to purify each other because, again, they're already impure. You can't become more impure. If you're impure, you're already impure, right? So why then the sages seem to be adding on another restriction on top of Torah law, and this might be a case of where it's two restrictions, right? It's a restriction upon a restriction, right? That the Zav and the Zava, the man and the spiritually impure man and woman cannot eat together, even though there's no chance of spiritually impurifying each other. Why, as the rabbis say? Because then they will become accustomed to sin, right? They might get used to eating each other when one of them is when they're spiritually impure, which they might then become accustomed to doing even when one of them is spiritually still pure, right? And the other one is spiritually pure. They might come to break the laws of the Torah. So this Mishnah almost completely consists of rabbinic fences that were created around the laws of Shabbat in one way or another, right? In order for that the rabbis really made in order to protect a Jew from violating Torah law, right? Now, these are not all the same, right? They're not. This is not all the cases that are listed in the Mishnah are not completely parallel. Each one actually is somewhat different than the other one. And so that's probably the reason why the Mishnah lists all these unique cases to try to understand what are the applications of this and how far ranging does the power that rabbis have to make decrees go, right? And to make fences around the Torah go. And of course, the Gemara is going to analyze this. The Talmud is going to analyze this. Let's keep moving now. So this is the material we learned in our previous session, just a nice little review of the Mishnah. Always important to review the Mishnah. Let's move on to some new material. This is actually Bar Tanora on the Mishnah. So Bar Tanora really was a rabbi who lived in medieval times, and he is really known as the foremost commentator on the Mishnah itself. So any kind of traditional standard edition of the Mishnah that you get is going to have usually the first commentary that you will have is Bar Tanora. Bar Tanora sort of acts like Rashi does on the Talmud. Now, of course, Rashi wrote in the Mishnah as well, so we can also quote from him. But I find a lot of times Bar Tanora either copies Rashi or more fully fleshes out what Rashi was thinking. And honestly, oftentimes the Bar Tanora is even clearer and more depthful than Rashi, at least on the Mishnah, which is why I think there's a need for Bar Tanora's commentary. It's not just that Rashi's commentary is printed in traditional editions of the Mishnah, but really Bar Tanora is used instead. It's a high compliment, obviously, to Bar Tanora. So this is what Bar Tanora has to say on this particular Mishnah. And I thought this was a very important comment. So the tailor should not go out with his needle, even if it is inserted in his clothing, lest he forget and go out. And for an artisan, it is the manner of his craft. He is liable for is the way of artisans to insert them in their clothing when they go out to the market. So this is important. And of course, I'm sorry about the grammar issue here. I translated this myself, and I was obviously moving a little too quickly. I forgot some prepositions here. But what the Bar Tanora is saying here, first of all, the Bar Tanora is helping us to understand that the tailor who's bringing the needle out is not carrying it with his hand. And that is the normal way that you would carry something, right? You put it in your hand, right? He's carrying it in an abnormal way. And what's important to know is that it's not even, you might say, okay, well, it's also normal to put the needle in one's pocket, right? To carry something in one's pocket. But he seems to be carrying it in an abnormal way. The Mishnah specifically seems to be saying, or the Bartanura seems to be saying, it's tachuba lo bebigdo, right? And of course, Rashi says this as well, but I like the way Bartanura said this better, right? That it's actually stuck in his shirt. So imagine a tailor who, on his lapel, puts his special needle or his good needle that he uses, he sticks it through his lapel as a way of carrying it, right? Now, is this the normal way you carry a needle, right? If you're going to bring it or transport a needle? No, right? Normally, you would either hold it or put it in your pocket. The idea is that when you are when you're carrying something on Shabbat or in any Shabbat violation, you have to be doing it to violate the Torah. You have to be doing it in the standard way in which people normally do it. Once there's a shinui of some sort or doing it in a different way, you're actually only breaking the Torah in a rabbinic way, right? For example, many people who believe that turning on lights on Shabbat is a violation of the Torah, is a violation of the Shabbat malacha of igniting a flame, who believe that electricity is fire. Some do, some don't. Every time they turn on a light, when they need to turn on a light on Shabbat, or when there's a really big need to turn on a light for Shabbat, many times either they'll ask their child who's below bar mitzvah age or bat mitzvah age to turn the light on, or they might even do it themselves, but they'll do it in a different way. They'll do it instead of putting the light switch with a finger, right? They'll use their knuckle to put on the light or something like that, or their elbow or something. And that's called doing it in action with the shinui. What that actively does, it's still a violation, but it's a violation of rabbinic law. It's not a violation of the Torah, because the Torah only prohibited by doing malachot in their standard or normal way that they do them. So at first glance, right, someone who has something poked in their shirt, right, that and carrying a needle out is not the normal way of carrying. So therefore, it would seem like the tailor, even if they went out on Shabbat with their needle poked into their shirt, it would only be a violation of rabbinic law, not a violation of Torah law, which is really, really important. So that's what he seems to first be saying and seems to be telling us. But he gives us really other important information. It seems that artisans at this time, and I think the same thing would hold true for a scribe as a tailor, is that they had the practice of putting needles or putting the object in which they did their craft into their shirts or into their clothing, and would display it because it acted almost like an advertisement, right? If you had a needle in your lapel, people would know that you're a tailor. So if they needed tailor services, they could see, oh, I saw a guy with a needle in his shirt. I can ask him to tailor my shirt or to do some work in that regard. Or if I see a guy with a quill through his shirt or tape to his shirt or on his shirt some way, it's an advertisement that that person's a scribe. So if I need the work of a scribe, I could see and I can go up to him and ask him to do some work for me and hire that person, right? So this was a standard sort of way in which professionals carry their tools of trade in order to advertise their business. So this being the case, right, as Bartanura says, right, he still would be liable from a Torah perspective, because although for most people this is an unusual practice to carry out a needle stuck in one's clothing, it is a usual or standard practice for a professional tailor or an artisan. And so once it becomes, therefore, he's doing something that would be considered standard practice or the standard way in which someone carries their needle, right? That means that now they're breaking the Torah law. Now, this is very interesting because a Torah law, therefore, or a Torah prohibition of Shabbat can therefore be broken sometimes based not on just the action itself, but actually on the status of the person, right? Because the person is a tailor, right, or is this professional, this is their job, they're now violating the Torah as in a Torah way, not just a rabbinic way, while someone who wasn't a tailor, who was doing literally the same action, would only be violating the Torah in a rabbinic way. The reason that the Bartanura, and the reason we're really going over this comment, one, it's important to know the situation in the Mishnah itself, but I think it's also really important, it's going to become important data to really understand for us that the Mishnah is talking about the breaking of a Torah prohibition. You might think by looking at this that it is just a rabbinic violation, but it is talking about a Torah violation, it seems. It seems from this, right, at least. Okay, that's Bartanura. Any questions so far before we move on to other sources? No, we understand everything? Good. Let's keep moving. So I just brought some of the Rashis, right? And again, Rashi just underlines the fact that this is all the distance a person from transgression. So they said it in order to distance a person or to create a distancing. They use that. The Rashi is here using it as a noun, not to distance, but a distancing, pushing away a person from transgression. Okay, so that seems to be clear from the Mishnah itself, right? Rashi then also makes us understand about the Zav in the case of the pure and the impure person. Remember about dining together specifically, that the kol sheken, and all the more so in a case of tahor ima zava, right? If the husband is pure, right, and the woman is impure, and this would usually be a case of menstrual impurity, right, where the woman has not gone to the mikveh yet or is still bleeding from her monthly period, right? Then all the more so, a man should not be eating traditionally, at least, with a woman in this case, and to distance himself from sin, so as not to impurify himself and come to touch her and impurify himself, and then also need to be purified to enter the confines of the Mishnah. Of the temple. So that's what Rashi seems to be saying. Last Rashi comment before we keep moving. Right, he kind of more deeply explains this mitnei hergel avera because of the customing of oneself to transgression. He says because once a person allows themselves to be alone with her, they might come to have sexual relations with her, which would be a transgression requiring our punishment of spiritual excision. Right, so making yourself impure purposely, right, by having sexual relations or having sexual relations with a woman is impure is a Torah prohibition, a very serious Torah prohibition. Spiritual excision or haret in Hebrew is actually the worst punishment that you can get, and that's not the man-made punishment done by man; it's a punishment done by God, right? But this is the breaking of of a Torah prohibition when a man has sex with a woman who's spiritually impure. Right, so in order to distance oneself from that, right, a person in technically in rabbinic law should not be alone with a woman, during her time of sexual ritual impurity. Right, this is traditionally the way it is, in still to this day, in the Orthodox world, and traditionally that it's not good to be alone. And in close contact with even one's wife when she is experiencing a time of spiritual impurity. For the most part, this is not observed in the conservative world, even of those who observe halacha, for example, with my wife and myself, because in general, it's felt to be, I think in our world, in the world of conservative Judaism, this is sort of felt to be inhumane to the woman, and it ends up cutting off women from being in society and being able to relate to men. And to be full partners. It's also it would be a lot of time, almost half the month or at least a quarter of the month. The husband and wife would not be able to be alone together, which I think is a problem for many conservative and more progressive minded Jews. So regardless. So that is what Rashi seems to be saying. I think we can draw out the conclusion there is what the fear of the rabbis is the breaking of a Torah prohibition. So therefore, when there's a fear of breaking a Torah prohibition, that one might fall into doing that a mistake if one does a particular action. The rabbis seem to be ready to create more violations or more stringencies in order to protect a person from breaking an actual Torah prohibition, which is really, really important. I mean, we do these things always in our life, right? If we're on a diet or trying to lose some weight and we don't want to eat too much, right? We might choose to not drive past our favorite or walk past our favorite donut place, right? Now, obviously, there's no problem with walking or driving past the donut place. It's not like you're going to absorb the calories from afar, but it puts yourself in a place of temptation where you might then come and eat the donut, right? So therefore, you should just distance yourself from the donut shop in general, and that protects you, right? So we do these kind of things all the time. It is just it's just very different when it's the rabbis who are doing this for us, right? Where there is a punishment. The punishment for breaking a rabbinic violation is not the same as the Torah, where it's the death penalty or something like that, or a sacrifice if you do it on mistake, but rather it's 40 lashes, right? Traditionally, someone who rebels against rabbinic authority by breaking a rabbinic law is lashed 40 times by the court. Obviously, we don't do this anymore, but it shows that there still is a real punishment. These are real laws, right? They really must be followed by a Torah observant Jew and taken seriously. We just have to understand that they're on a different, they're held to a different culpability than a Torah violation, if that makes sense. Sounds good so far? Okay. We're going to keep moving. And I think this is the kind of the part that really sort of started to stun me. And I think really explains very well, where are the limits of this? Because, as rabbis, right, this is a very powerful thing. If a rabbi were, okay, maybe it's not like me, but at least the rabbis back then, these great rabbis from 2,000 years ago, could just say something is prohibited, even though the Torah doesn't say it's prohibited. How far-reaching is that power? The rabbis sort of have full legislative power that whatever they say is prohibited is prohibited, they can just say anything. It's just basically a whim, or are there limits? Are there checks and balances on rabbinic authority, on what we would call human authority, to make laws that the whole entire Jewish community is obligated to, because the Torah actually says to us, you have to observe the source of rabbinic authority in this way, is that Deuteronomy actually says that we have to follow the judges in their time, right? So whatever rabbinic judges of the Jewish community that exist in this time, even if you don't like them that much, right, or you don't even agree with them, you still have to observe their rulings, right, in that regard, according to this passage and the way the rabbis read that passage in Deuteronomy. So obviously this is very powerful. So we really have to understand, what are the checks and balances? How far does this really go? And of course, that I think for me is a very interesting conversation in terms about power and where does power stem from, especially for Jewish leaders. And the Tosefta, I think, I'm sorry, not the Tosefta, the Tosafot, I think answers this question very well. Now, what is the Tosafot? The Tosafot literally means additional. Tosafot means additions, right? Lahosif is to add on. And what this really was is the rabbis who wrote the Tosafot, or whose thoughts or arguments are recorded in the Tosafot, were actually the grandchildren of Rashi, were the generation of the grandchildren of Rashi, and many other as well sages of that time are collected together. And the Tosafot really main function is to compare passages of the Talmud with other passages of the Talmud, especially when they don't, I'm not getting the right word for this. When they don't, especially when those two passages of the Talmud don't agree with each other, right? There's a big problem if in one place in the Talmud it says to do one thing, and in another place in the Talmud it says to do another thing. Which place in the Talmud do you follow? And those are the kind of conflicts that the Tosafot is really interested in trying to understand. And in that way, Tosafot is often framed as a commentary that looks at the meta conversation going in on the page, while Rashi, the other main commentary on the Torah, the Talmud, is more interested in the micro conversation, in defining the words and the phrases and the concepts that appear on the page itself. For this reason, it's usually traditional to learn Rashi first and begin learning Gemara with Rashi, and only then, after a couple of years, to start looking at Tosafot. Because Tosafot, one, it's a relatively difficult commentary to understand, and two, it often pushes us into areas of the Talmud that are not really on the page. But for this one in particular, I think it's really, really important and really opens up this discussion of checks and balances. So let's take a look. I translated this Tosafot into English. Sometimes the sources won't be translated into English. I'll just do it orally. This one I had some time to translate actually into English. So let's take a look. Okay, so this is what the Tosafot says. And by the way, on a traditional page of Talmud, Rashi is on one side of the page in the commentary, usually on the inside of the page. And on the outside of the page is the Tosafot commentary, written in smaller letters next to the actual text of the Talmud itself. So let's take a look at this particular Tosafot. So this Tosafot is on the words from the Mishnah, lest a person forget and go out. So here we go. The Tosafot says, according to the opinion of Rabbi, who said that one should not decree a decree on a decree, okay? I know it sounds a weird word. Eventually, later in the Gemara, and we're going to read this very soon, maybe today if we get to it, maybe next session, Rabbi is going to eventually say a very important comment, and which is a general rule that one should not, that the rabbis should not make a decree on something that is already a decree. And that's the decree in Hebrew is gezerah, and that really means a fence or a rabbinic enactment around the Torah law, right? When the rabbis create an extra law to protect us from mistakenly violating the Torah. That's what we've been talking about here. And basically, the Mishnah is entirely examples of, right, rabbinic enactments or gezerot that protect a person from violating a Torah law. All right. So the Rabbah in the Gemara, we're going to see, has the opinion that that the rabbis do not have the authority to make a decree on a decree, to make a rabbinic enactment upon a rabbinic enactment. So what is he talking about? So what is he talking about here? Well, he's about to explain it. So let's try to understand why the Tosafot is saying this here, and then we'll try to unpack it. So he says that one should not make a decree on a decree, according to Rabbah, or a gezerah on a gezerah. One, because of this idea, according to Rabbah's interpretation, one should not explain that the Mishnah is concerned, lest one forget that the needle is upon them. Right? So, at least in this example, or at least in this understanding, and again, especially if we don't have bar tenora, right? If you just read the Mishnah itself, right? If someone carries out a needle, right? Either carries out a needle in one's hand or puts it in one's pocket, which is what you would assume by reading the Mishnah. Again, if you didn't have bar tenora, you didn't have Rashi. Bar tenora is just trying to help us out with what eventually will be the opinion, right? Or one way the Gemara solves this problem, right? So if you imagine what the case that the Mishnah is talking about is someone who has a needle in their hand or a needle in one's pocket, right? We've learned already that even if one were to do this on Shabbat mistakenly, right? This is not really a Torah violation. This is a rabbinic violation, right? So even honestly, if one has, even if it's the condition of, it's not just a person holding it in their hand and going out, or even if it's a person, a tailor in this case, a professional who has the needle in their on their lapel, right, and they're carrying it out in the standard way that professionals carry it, which would be a Torah violation, because the tailor, at least according to a simple reading of the Mishnah, is doing this on mistake. Right, is mistakenly doing this, right? The tailor is not meaning to break Shabbat by doing this. They just forgot that the needle was on their lapel, and they walk out on Shabbat because they had it stuck in there before Shabbat, right? And then they break Shabbat in doing so. Even in that case, the they're going to say, Tosafot's going to say, and in general it's true, that that's not breaking a Torah prohibition. Now, why? Because the Torah only prohibits what they call malacha machshevet, right? Or prohibited labor that is intentional, right? Technically, when I do a Shabbat prohibition on mistake, I'm actually not breaking the Torah. I'm only breaking a rabbinic fence, right? And the rabbis created another decree around this of prohibiting the doing of any Shabbat violation of the Torah on mistake, right? Because then some people might become less careful with their Shabbat observance, and might fall into and might become too lenient. If a Shabbat violation happens on mistake, it's no big deal, right? Well, it is a big deal. And the rabbis pushed us and distanced us from saying that by saying that we should take ourselves out of the situation where you might come to violate a Torah prohibition on mistake, right? In this case, if someone mistakenly violated a Torah commandment, right, they would have to bring a sacrifice to the Beit HaMikdash, a chatat offering, right, a sin offering, and that would purify one or enable God to forgive you for violating that Torah prohibition. Right? It's much different than if the person carries on Shabbat on purpose, they're liable to the death penalty if there are two witnesses who see them doing it and warn them that by doing so they're liable for the death penalty, right? It's a much more lenient punishment when doing it on mistake. Why? Because it's only a rabbinic violation at that point. Very important. Okay, so the Gemara, the Tosafot is continuing saying, one should not explain that the Mishnah is concerned lest one forget that the needle is upon. Now, why? Why shouldn't we understand the Mishnah in a simple reading, in the simple way it sounds? And he's going to explain. The reason for this is because even if one went out with the needle on Shabbat, there would be no actual Torah prohibition that would be broken, right? And this is what we've already explained, right? If someone goes out on Shabbat with a needle in their lapel and they forgot because they put the lapel on the needle on earlier, they're only doing it on mistake. They didn't mean to do it. They didn't even realize the needle's on them necessarily. So in that case, because it's mistaken, all right. Therefore, it is not it is only a rabbinic violation. If therefore the Mishnah is saying we're going to create another fence on this and saying even by putting the needle, we're not even allowed to put the needle in our lapel. The tailor is not even allowed to put the tailor in the lapel near Shabbat, as the Mishnah seems to be saying, because there's a fear that you might bring it out on Shabbat. According to the rule of Rabbi, who says that you can't make a decree on a decree, that there can't be a rabbinic fence around a rabbinic fence, that this is extending the authority of rabbinic power too far and becoming too stringent, right? The Mishnah cannot be saying this because of course, Rabbi has to agree with the Mishnah, and he cannot disagree with the Mishnah because he's an Amora, and the Mishnah is considered Tanaitic material or earlier material that the Rabbi can't disagree with. All right, so the Mishnah therefore cannot be saying, according to the Tosafot, that this is just a simple case of someone who forgot to take the needle out of their shirt and mistakenly went out on Shabbat, right? Or forgot that the needle is upon their shirt. That can't be, right? And they draw this really, as we learned in Bava Kama 26b, that in a case where a person recognized it but then forgot it, they should be exempt from bringing a sacrifice, since the Torah only prohibited intentional labor, right? So specifically, right, even in a case where a person, for Bava Kama seems to rule in the Gemara, right, and seems to say, Bava Kama is another tractate in the Talmud dealing with civil law, really, and damages, personal damages, again, so when one person hurts another person or their property hurts another, something like that. Right, rules specifically that when someone brings an object out on Shabbat and they forget it, right, and forgot that they were doing this or didn't mean to do this or didn't even know that they had something on it, they would be exempt from bringing a sacrifice. Why? Because they didn't actually ever break a Torah law, because the Torah only prohibits intentional labor on Shabbat. So one is actually not breaking a Shabbat law, so therefore one shouldn't bring a sacrifice, right? I made a mistake when I said that bringing a sacrifice is a violation, is the response to a violation of rabbinic law. A response to a violation of rabbinic law or a punishment to a breaking of a rabbinic law is lashes. Okay, very important here. So it's a really interesting argument that the Tosafot's making here, and trying to make the Mishnah agree with Rabbah's understanding that we can't do this, right? And so therefore the Tosafot needs to come up with a different interpretation of what the Mishnah is actually saying in order to make it agree with Rabbah's understanding that the rabbis cannot make a fence around the fence, right? The rabbis can only make a fence around the Torah prohibition. They cannot make a fence around the rabbinic prohibition. So therefore they reinterpret it. And they say, therefore, lest one forgets is in reference to forgetting to put the needle away before Shabbat, in which case the tailor might see the needle upon him on Shabbat and forget that it is Shabbat and then go out. So let's understand what the Tosafot is saying. It's a little complicated thought that they're saying, but it's really interesting. The problem is not that the person forgot that they had the needle on them, right? And then therefore didn't realize they were carrying. The people knew, the tailor knew they were carrying the needle. They knew that they specifically saw that the needle was on them before they walked out of their house. But what did they forget? They looked at the needle and they said, because I have the needle on my shirt, it must not be Shabbat, right? Because that's my work outfit, right? I'm working right now. And because they see they didn't put away their needle and they see the needle on Shabbat, they think it's not actually Shabbat. So therefore, they intentionally go out with the needle on them, and therefore they're doing intentional labor. They just don't realize the mistake, or what the Mishnah means when it says Shema Yishkach, lest he forget, is not lest he forget that the needle's on him, but rather lest he forget that Shabbat is actually happening right now, that it's actually Shabbat. And according, obviously, the implication from the Tosafot here is that if one forgets that it's Shabbat and intentionally does something that would be considered a Shabbat Torah violation, it is still a breaking of the Torah. A person should know whether it's Shabbat or whether it's not Shabbat, and that's not considered unintentional labor. When the Torah defines when the Talmud, the way the rabbis and ways the Tosafot here seems to be defining what is intentional labor means, I intend to do the actual action that I want to do, right? I want to carry the needle out. Right? So I'm intentionally carrying the needle out. It doesn't have to do with knowing whether it's Shabbat or intentionally trying to violate the Torah. Rather, it's about intentionally doing the action. You see the slight difference? There's a small difference there, right? It's the difference between intentionally doing an action. I'm intentionally going to bring the needle out versus I'm going to intentionally break Shabbat. I'm just going to repeat it because it's a little bit of a complicated concept, right? What the rabbis mean here, right, is that what the problem here, or what is breaks the Torah, is doing an object, doing an intentional labor, right, that in which we do on Shabbat, which therefore would break Shabbat if one has forgotten that it's Shabbat, right? That is considered a Torah violation, while unintentionally bringing out a needle, even if one knows that Shabbat, is considered an unintentional labor and is not breaking the laws of Shabbat. So I think this is a really interesting idea because what this shows us in this sort of radical reinterpretation that the Tosafot is doing on the Mishnah here really shows us that, at least for the Tosafot, it's really, 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 really important, and that they seem to agree with Rabbah, and they seem to agree with this idea that rabbis cannot make fences around rabbinic law, right? And the reason for this is because the whole point of making fences around rabbinic law, the whole point and the whole source of rabbinic power is to protect Jews from violating the Torah, from the laws of the Torah. Not the point of rabbinic power is not to prevent Jews from violating rabbinic laws or rabbinic advice that they make, right? That would be an abuse of power, according to the Talmud. And I think there's something that's really powerful about this, and really got me to say that this is real humility here, and this represents a real tzimtzum or constriction of rabbinic power, right? That rabbinic power only should be used to prevent a Jew from violating the actual Torah, not from violating some rabbinic norm that the rabbi set up. This provides a nice protection from making too many stringencies that make life really unlivable, or gives too much power to rabbis and too much impact on the life of everyday Jews that the rabbis have. This is an example of checks and balances within the rabbinic system, which of course I think is beautiful, especially as an American, that we see this here. We're going to continue to explore this concept next week when we go into the actual Talmud and look at the opinions of Rabbi and Abaye as they disagree on this particular idea and how Gemara is going to apply this and develop these and discuss these laws. I hope you enjoyed our learning today. I really appreciate, of course, learning with you. And we'll learn again. I believe the next session is next Thursday at 10 a.m. Please feel free to join us in person, online. We'll quickly put this up on YouTube and on podcast, and we'll try to put the text sheet also in the episode description for at least for the podcast, so that you can see it. And obviously, if you have any suggestions, you have any questions, any way to make this learning better for you, feel free to email me with comments, questions, concerns, what have you. At my email address is rmr@templeofaaron.org. rmr@templeofaaron.org. Thank you for learning with me today, and until next time.